Welcome back to ET Audio Tutorial channel. We hope you will have a wonderful learning experience here with us. You can download and listen to these audiobooks at your preferred time. Our videos are designed as audio podcasts to help you keep studying at times where you may not be able to watch video or as you are completing another task to better use your time. You can listen to these tutorials at night, doing another task, while taking a walk, lunchtime or any other time you like. This is the second chapter of Freshman Moral and Civics course taught in all the Ethiopian universities. This chapter deals with approaches to ethics. It is tailored exactly to the fitting of the Ethiopian Ministry of Education curriculum but is also very useful for any related course. I am very happy you have chosen this channel in your study and politely ask that you subscribe, like and share the channel for more amazing tutorials. Now, without further ado, let's begin our course. Chapter 2, Approaches to Ethics. Human beings ask questions about nature of morality. In the process of prescriptive inquiry, we employ a specific vocabulary. We also invoke theories to explain the nature of morality. All moral theories address the questions of what is good, why it's good, and where the good is located. If there is anything easy about moral inquiry, it's the fact that there are only three basic kinds of prescriptive moral theories: teleological theories, deontological theories, and virtue-based theories. Unfortunately, they often, but not always, provide different and mostly conflicting answers to these basic questions. This chapter aims to introduce you to various ethical theories, discuss ideas, feelings and questions about activities regarded as right or wrong, good or bad, explain why there are particular rules about what is right or wrong, good or bad behavior for different groups and situations, analyze the ethical dimensions of various rules and codes of behavior, examine the personal and community factors involved in defining beliefs about what is right or wrong, good or bad behavior, analyze how different contexts and situations influence personal values, attitudes, beliefs and behaviors. Critically analyze how groups justify particular actions and behaviors. Normative ethics. We may now begin our review of problems and views in the area of normative ethics, starting with the theory of obligation and then going on to the theory of moral value and, finally, to the theory of non-moral value. The ultimate concern of the normative theory of obligation is to guide us in the making of decisions and judgments about actions in particular situations. A main concern, of course, is to guide us in our capacity as agents trying to decide what we should do in this case and in that. But we want to know more than just what we should do in situations before us. We also wish to make judgments about what others should do, especially if they ask us about what we or they should have done, about whether what we or someone else did was right or wrong, and so on. We are not just agents in morality, we are also spectators, advisors, instructors, judges, and critics. Still, in all of these capacities our primary question is this: how may or should we decide or determine what is morally right for a certain agent, oneself or another, possibly a group or a whole society, to do, or what he morally ought to do, in a certain situation? Normative ethics offers theories or accounts of the best way to live. These theories evaluate actions in a systematic way, that is, they may focus on outcomes or duties or motivation as a means of justifying human conduct. Includes ethical theories or approaches such as utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, principlism, narrative ethics and feminist ethics. Normative ethics poses questions of the following kind: are there general principles or rules that we could follow which distinguish between right and wrong? Or, idearises, are there virtues and or relationships that we can nurture in order to behave well? Teleological ethics. Consequentialist. It is referred as the end justifies the means. It believes in purpose, ends or goals of an action. It stressed that the consequences of an action determines the morality or immorality of a given action, which means an action is judged as right or wrong, moral or immoral depending on what happens because of it. One may have the best intention or follow the highest moral principles, but if the result, moral act is harmful, or bad, it must be judged as morally or ethically wrong act. Having agreed on one ground or another that the standard of right and wrong cannot be simply the prevailing set of moral rules, moral philosophers have offered us a variety of alternative standards. In general, their views have been of two sorts: 1. Deontological theories and 2. Teleological ones. A teleological theory says that the basic or ultimate criterion or standard of what is morally right, wrong, obligatory, etc., is the non-moral value that is brought into being. The final appeal, directly or indirectly, must be to the comparative amount of good produced, or rather to the comparative balance of good over evil produced. Thus, an act is right if and only if it or the rule under which it falls produces, will probably produce, or is intended to produce at least as great a balance of good over evil as any available alternative. An act is wrong if and only if it does not do so. An act ought to be done if and only if it or the rule under which it falls produces, will probably produce, or is intended to produce a greater balance of good over evil than any available alternative. It is important to notice here that, for a teleologist, the moral quality or value of actions, persons, or traits of character, is dependent on the comparative non-moral value of what they bring about or try to bring about. For the moral quality or value of something to depend on the moral value of whatever it promotes would be circular. Teleological theories, then, make the right, the obligatory, and the morally good dependent on the non-morally good. Accordingly, they also make the theory of moral obligation and moral value dependent, in a sense, on the theory of non-moral value. In order to know whether something is right, ought to be done, or is morally good, one must first know what is good in the non-moral sense and whether the thing in question promotes or is intended to promote what is good in this sense. It should also be noticed, however, that teleologists may hold various views about what is good in the non-moral sense. Teleologists have often been hedonists, identifying the good with pleasure and evil with pain, and concluding that the right course or rule of action is that which produces at least as great a balance of pleasure over pain as any alternative would. But they may be and have sometimes been non-hedonists, identifying the good with power, knowledge, self-realization, perfection, etc. This fact must not be forgotten when we are evaluating the teleological theory of obligation. All that is necessary is that the teleologist have some view about what is good or bad, and that he determine what is right or obligatory by asking what is conducive to the greatest balance of good over evil. Deontological theories deny what teleological theories affirm. They deny that the right, the obligatory, and the morally good are wholly, whether directly or indirectly, a function of what is non-morally good or of what promotes the greatest balance of good over evil for self, one's society, or the world as a whole. They assert that there are other considerations that may make an action or rule right or obligatory besides the goodness or badness of its consequences, certain features of the act itself other than the value it brings into existence, for example, the fact that it keeps a promise, is just, or is commanded by God or by the state. Teleologists believe that there is one and only one basic or ultimate right-making characteristic, namely, the comparative value, non-moral, of what is, probably will be, or is intended to be brought into being. Deontologists either deny that this characteristic is right-making at all or they insist that there are other basic or ultimate right-making characteristics as well. For them the principle of maximizing the balance of good over evil, no matter for whom, is either not a moral criterion or standard at all, or, at least, it is not the only basic or ultimate one. To put the matter in yet another way, a deontologist contends that it is possible for an action or rule of action to be the morally right or obligatory one even if it does not promote the greatest possible balance of good over evil for self, society, or universe. It may be right or obligatory simply because of some other fact about it or because of its own nature. It follows that a deontologist may also adopt any kind of a view about what is good or bad in the non-moral sense. Teleologists differ on the question of whose good it is that one ought to try to promote. Ethical egoism holds that one is always to do what will promote his own greatest good, that an act or rule of action is right if and only if it promotes at least as great a balance of good over evil for him in the long run as any alternative would, and wrong if it does not. This view was held by Epicurus, Hobbes, and Nietzsche, among others. Ethical universalism, or what is usually called utilitarianism, takes the position that the ultimate end is the greatest general good, that an act or rule of action is right, if and only if it is, or probably is, conducive to at least as great a balance of good over evil in the universe as a whole as any alternative would be, wrong if it is not, and obligatory if it is or probably is conducive to the greatest possible balance of good over evil in the universe. The so-called utilitarians, for example, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, have usually been hedonists in their view about what is good, asserting that the moral end is the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. But some utilitarians are not hedonists, for example, G. E. Murray and Hastings Rational, and so have been called ideal utilitarians. That is, Utilitarianism is a certain kind of teleological theory of obligation and does not entail any particular theory of value. Although a utilitarian must accept some particular theory of value, it would also be possible, of course, to adopt teleological theories intermediate between ethical egoism and utilitarianism. For example, theories that say the right act or rule is one conducive to the greatest balance of good over evil for a certain group, one's nation, class, family, or race. A pure ethical altruist might even contend that the right act or rule is the one that most promotes the good of other people. We shall, however, limit our coming discussion to egoism and universalism. Egoism, ethical and psychological egoism. Ethical egoism, we usually assume that moral behavior, or being ethical, has to do with not being overly concerned with oneself. In other words, selfishness is assumed to be an acceptable attitude. Even among scholars, there is disagreement about what constitutes ethical behavior. Since very early in Western intellectual history, the viewpoint that humans are not built to look out for other people's interests has surfaced regularly. Some scholars even hold that proper moral conduct consists of looking out for number one. Period. These viewpoints are known as psychological egoism and ethical egoism respectively. We may focus on the consequences of our actions because we believe that those consequences justify our actions. In other words, that the end justify the means, but this does not necessarily imply that the consequences we hope for are good in the egoist sense that may maximize happiness for oneself. We might, for instance, not agree with the Italian statesman Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, that if the end is to maintain political power for oneself, one's king or one's political party, then this will justify any means that one might use for that purpose, such as force, surveillance, or even deceit. Although this famous theory is indeed consequentialist, it does not qualify as utilitarian, because it doesn't have the common good as its ultimate end. Even deceit. Although this famous theory is indeed consequentialist, it does not qualify as utilitarian, because it doesn't have the common good as its ultimate end. Please, take a few minutes to give your view on the following case. Some years ago, a Good Samaritan stopped to help a man whose car had broken down on the freeway. The man shot and killed the Samaritan, stole his car, and proceeded to lead the police on a high-speed chase. Eventually he ran out of gas and began a shootout with the police, who subsequently killed him. This, of course, didn't bring the Samaritan back to life. Although most people would admire the Good Samaritan for what he did, and although we may deplore the fact that few people now would be inclined to follow his example, the ethical egoist would say that the Samaritan did the wrong thing. For ethical egoism, there is only one rule: look after yourself. You have no business stopping for anybody on the freeway. Indeed, the ethical egoist would say, if you do stop, you are throwing your life away. This theory is called ethical egoism simply because it is an ethical theory, a normative theory about how we ought to behave. The theory implies that we ought to be selfish, or, to put it more gently, we ought to be self-interested. Calling the theory ethical does not suggest that there might be a decent way to be selfish. It just means that ethical egoism is a theory that advocates egoism as a moral rule. You should look after yourself. Ethical egoist insisted that if you don't take advantage of a situation, you are foolish. They claim that it makes good sense to look after yourself, and morality is a result of that self-interest. If I mistreat others, they mistreat me, so I resolved to behave myself. This is a rather twisted version of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is twisted because it is peculiarly slanted toward our own self-interests. The reason we should treat others the way we would like to be treated is that it gives us a good chance of receiving just such treatment. We do it for ourselves, not for others. So, do unto others so that you will be done unto in a similar way. One argument for ethical egoism follows immediately from the theory of psychological egoism, which we examined in the previous section. If I am psychologically programmed to act only in my own best interest, then I can never be obligated to perform altruistic, that is, selfless, acts toward others. More formally, the argument is this: 1. We all always seek to maximize our own self-interest. Definition of psychological egoism. 2. If one cannot do an act, one has no obligation to do that act. Ought to implies can. 3. Altruistic acts involve putting other people's interests ahead of our own. Definition of altruism. 4. But, altruism contradicts psychological egoism and so is impossible, by premises 1 and 3. 5. Therefore, altruistic acts are never morally obligatory, by premises 2 and 4. So the ethical egoist might certainly decide to stop for a stranded motorist on the freeway, not for the sake of the motorist but to ensure that what goes around, comes around. The golden rule usually emphasizes others, but for the ethical egoist it emphasizes the self. Any theory that looks solely to consequences of actions is known as a consequentialist theory. The consequences that ethical egoism stipulates are good consequences for the person taking the action. Saying that people ought to look after themselves need not, of course, mean that one should annoy others whenever possible, step on their toes, or deliberately neglect their interests. It simply suggests that one should do what will be of long-term benefit to oneself, such as exercising, eating healthy food, avoiding repetitive argumentative situations, abstaining from overeating, and so forth. In conjunction, it suggests that other people's interests are of no importance. If you might advance your own interests by helping others, then by all means help others, but only if you are the main beneficiary. It is fine to help your children get ahead in school, because you love them and this love is a rationale for you. But there is no reason to lend a hand to your neighbor's children, unless you like them or you achieve gratification through your action. This interpretation, which tells us to do whatever will benefit ourselves, results in a rewriting of the golden rule, because, obviously, it is not always the case that you will get the same treatment from others that you give to them. Occasionally you might get away with not treating others decently because they may never know that you are the source of the bad treatment they are receiving. Ethical egoism tells you that it is perfectly alright to treat others in a way that is to your advantage and not to theirs, as long as you can be certain that you will get away with it. The following are some methods to apply the principle of ethical egoism to a particular situation. List the possible acts. For each act, see how much net good it would do for you and identify the act that does the most net good for you. Some important things to notice about ethical egoism. Idearesis: it does not just say that, from the moral point of view, one's own welfare counts as well as that of others. Rather, it says that, from the moral point of view, only one's own welfare counts, and others does not, when one is making a moral decision about how to act. Idearesis: ethical egoism does not forbid one to help others, or require one to harm others. It just says that whatever moral reason you have to help others, or not harm them, must ultimately stem from the way in which helping them or not harming them helps you. Ethical egoism does not say that one ought always to do what is most pleasurable, or enjoyable. It acknowledges that one's own self-interest may occasionally require pain or sacrifice. Psychological egoism: the main argument that has been used as a basis for ethical egoism is a psychological one, an argument from human nature. We were also constituted, it is said, that one always seeks one's own advantage or welfare, or always does what he thinks will give him the greatest balance of good over evil. In Butler's terms, this means that self-love is the only basic principle in human nature. In one set of contemporary terms, it means that ego satisfaction is the final aim of all activity, or that the pleasure principle is the basic drive in every individual. If this is so, the argument continues, we must recognize this fact in our moral theory and infer that our basic ethical principle must be that of self-love, albeit cool self-love. To hold anything else is to fly in the face of the facts. It is usual here to object that one cannot logically infer an ethical conclusion from a psychological premise in this way. This objection has some force, as we shall see in Chapter 6. But the egoist may not be doing this. He may only be contending that, if human nature is as he describes it, it is simply unrealistic and even unreasonable to propose that we ought basically to do anything but what is for our own greatest good. For, in a sense, we cannot do anything but this, except by mistake, and, as a famous dictum has it, ought implies can. Thus understood, the psychological argument for ethical egoism is at least reasonable, even if it is not logically compelling. Thus, ethical egoism has generally presupposed what is called psychological egoism, that each of us is always seeking his own greatest good, whether this is conceived of as pleasure, happiness, knowledge, power, self-realization, or a mixed life. The question is not whether egoism is strong in human nature, but whether we ever have any concern or desire for the welfare of others except as a means to our own, any concern for or interest in their welfare for its own sake, which is not derived from our concern for our own welfare. In dealing with this ethical theory, 1. That the desire for one's own good presupposes or builds upon the existence of more basic desires for food, fame, sex, etc. If we did not have any of these primary appetites, we would not have any good to be concerned about. Our welfare consists of the satisfaction of such desires. 2. It follows that the object of these basic desires is not one's own welfare, it is food, fame, sex, etc., as the case may be. One's own good is not the object of all of one's desires but only of one of them, self-love. 3. That in some cases the object of a basic desire is something for oneself, for example, food or the eating of food. But there is no necessity about this. The object may be something for someone else, for example, enjoying the sight of the ocean. In other words, there may be altruistic impulses. There may also be a desire to do the right as such. Whether there are such desires or not is a question of empirical fact. 4. As a matter of fact, there are such altruistic interests in the welfare of others. Sheer malevolence, if it exists, is a desire that another experience pain for its own sake, as well as a desire to do the right as such. At this point it is usual for the psychological egoist to say, yes, we do things for others, but we get satisfaction out of doing them, and this satisfaction is our end in doing them. Doing them is only a means to this satisfaction. Hence, even in doing altruistic things for others, like taking them to see the ocean, we are seeking our own good. To this criticism, some argued that, of course, we get satisfaction out of doing such things, but we do not want to do them because of the satisfaction we expect to get out of them. We get satisfaction out of doing them because we wanted to do them. The psychological egoist is putting the cart before the horse. They confuses the object of B's desire, A's enjoying the ocean, with the satisfaction that results for B when this object is attained. Suppose B fails to get A to the ocean or that A does not enjoy seeing it, then B will experience frustration, but it will not follow that this frustration is his goal. He experiences frustration because his goal is to have A enjoy himself. Generally, egoistic and particularistic consequentialism only takes into consideration how the consequences of an act will affect oneself or a given group, for example one's family, fellow citizens, compatriots, class or race. Moral rightness depends on the consequences for an individual agent or a limited group. Utilitarianism, producing the best consequences, that action is best, which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Suppose you are at Jijiga with a dying millionaire. With his final words, he begs you for one final favor. I've dedicated my whole life to football and for 50 years have gotten endless pleasure rooting for the Ethiopian Coffee Club. Now that I am dying, I want to give all my assets, $2 million, to the Ethiopian Coffee Club. Pointing to a box containing money in large bills, he continues, would you take this money back to Addis Ababa and give it to the Ethiopian Coffee Club owner so that they can buy better players? You agree to carry out his wish, at which point a huge smile of relief and gratitude breaks out on his face as he expires in your arms. After traveling to Addis Ababa, you see a newspaper advertisement placed by your favorite charity, the Ethiopian Red Cross Society, ERCS, whose integrity you do not doubt, pleading for $2 million to be used to save 100,000 people dying of starvation. Not only will the $2 million save their lives, but it will also purchase equipment and the kinds of fertilizers necessary to build a sustainable economy. You decide to reconsider your promise to the dying Ethiopian Coffee Club fan, in light of this advertisement. What is the right thing to do in this case? Consider some traditional moral principles and see if they help us come to a decision. One principle often given to guide action is let your conscience be your guide. Suppose your conscience tells you to give the money to the Ethiopian Coffee Club and my conscience tells me to give the money to the Ethiopian Red Cross Society, ERCS. How can we even discuss the matter? If conscience is the end of it, we're left mute. Another principle urged on us is do whatever is most loving. Love is surely a wonderful value. It is a more wholesome attitude than hate, and we should overcome feelings of hate if only for our own psychological health. But is love enough to guide our actions when there is a conflict of interest? Love is blind, it has been said, but reason, like marriage, is an eye-opener. Whom should I love in the case of the disbursement of the millionaire's money, the millionaire or the starving people? It's not clear how love alone will settle anything. In fact, it is not obvious that we must always do what is most loving. Should we always treat our enemies in loving ways? Or is it morally permissible to feel hate for those who have purposely and unjustly harmed us, our loved ones, or other innocent people? Should the survivors of Auschwitz love Adolf Hitler? Love alone does not solve difficult moral issues. A third principle often given to guide our moral actions is the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. This, too, is a noble rule of thumb, one that works in simple, common sense situations. But it has problems. First, it cannot be taken literally. Thus, the rule must be modified: do to others as you would have them do to you if you were in their shoes. However, this still has problems. Likewise, the golden rule doesn't tell me to whom to give the millionaire's money. Conscience, love, and the golden rule are all worthy rules of thumb to help us through life. They work for most of us, most of the time, in ordinary moral situations. But, in more complicated cases, especially when there are legitimate conflicts of interests, they are limited. A more promising strategy for solving dilemmas is that of following definite moral rules. Suppose you decided to give the millionaire's money to the Ethiopian Coffee Club to keep your promise, or because to do otherwise would be stealing. The principle you followed would be always keep your promise. Principles are important in life. If you decided to act on the principle of keeping promises, then you adhere to a type of moral theory called deontology. As you will see so far, that deontological systems maintain that the center of value is the act or kind of act. Certain features in the act itself have intrinsic value. For example, a deontologist would see something intrinsically wrong in the very act of lying. If, on the other hand, you decided to give the money to the Ethiopian Red Cross Society, ERCS, to save an enormous number of lives and restore economic solvency to the society, you sided with the type of theory called teleological ethics. Sometimes, it is referred to as consequentialist ethics. The center of value here is the outcome or consequences of the act. For example, a teleologist would judge whether lying was morally right or wrong by the consequences it produced. We have already examined one type of teleological ethics, ethical egoism, the view that the act that produces the most amount of good for the agent is the right act. Egoism is teleological ethics narrowed to the agent himself or herself. Unlike ethical egoism, utilitarianism is a universal teleological system. It calls for the maximization of goodness in society, that is, the greatest goodness for the greatest number and not merely the good of the agent. Classic utilitarianism. In our normal lives we use utilitarian reasoning all the time. As a formal ethical theory, the seeds of utilitarianism were sown by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, 342–270 BCE, who stated that pleasure is the goal that nature has ordained for us. It is also the standard by which we judge everything good. According to this view, rightness and wrongness are determined by pleasure or pain that something produces. Epicurus's theory focused largely on the individual's personal experience of pleasure and pain, and to that extent he advocated a version of ethical egoism. Nevertheless, Epicurus inspired a series of 18th-century philosophers who emphasized the notion of general happiness, that is, the pleasing consequences of actions that impact others and not just the individual. The classical expressions of utilitarianism, though, appear in the writings of two English philosophers and social reformers, Jeremy Bentham, 1748–1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873. They were the non-religious ancestors of the 20th century secular humanists, optimistic about human nature and our ability to solve our problems without recourse to God. Engaged in a struggle for legal as well as moral reform, they were impatient with the rule-bound character of law and morality in 18th and 19th century Great Britain and tried to make the law serve human needs and interests. Jeremy Bentham, quantity over quality. There are two main features of utilitarianism, both of which Bentham articulated. The consequentialist principle, or its teleological aspect, states that the rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or badness of the results that flow from it. It is the end, not the means, that counts. The end justifies the means. And the utility principle, or its hedonic aspect, states that the only thing that is good, outcome of an act which makes it right. Moral rightness or wrongness is calculated by determining the extent to which the action promotes values such as pleasure, well-being, happiness, etc. To this extent, the end justifies the means. In many respects, deontological moral theory is diametrically the opposite of utilitarianism. It is referred as the means justifies the end. It is coined as deontics. This is a theory that the rightness or wrongness of moral action is determined, at least partly, with reference to formal rules of conduct rather than consequences or result of an action. It is an emphasis on the intentions, motives, moral principles or performance of duty rather than results, as the sign of right action, morality and immorality. It is a duty-based, and according to this theory, The consequences or results of our action have nothing to do with their rightness or wrongness. Performance of one's own duty. The 17th century German philosopher Samuel Pufendorf, who classified dozens of duties under three headings: duties to God, duties to oneself and duties to others. Concerning our duties towards God, he argued that there are two kinds: 1. A theoretical duty to know the existence and nature of God, and 2. A practical duty to both inwardly and outwardly worship God. Concerning our duties towards oneself, these are also of two sorts: 1. Duties of the soul, which involve developing one's skills and talents, and 2. Duties of the body, which involve not harming our bodies, as we might through gluttony or drunkenness, and not killing oneself. Concerning our duties towards others, Pufendorf divides these between absolute duties, which are universally binding on people, and conditional duties, which are the result of contracts between people. Absolute duties are of three sorts: 1. Avoid wronging others, 2. Treat people as equals, and 3. Promote the good of others. Conditional duties involve various types of agreements, the principal one of which is the duty is to keep one's promises. The Divine Command Theory. According to one view, called the Divine Command Theory, DCT, ethical principles are simply the commands of God. They derive their validity from God's commanding them, and they mean commanded by God. Without God, there would be no universally valid morality. We can analyze the DCT into three separate theses. 1. Morality, that is, rightness and wrongness, originates with God. 2. Moral rightness simply means willed by God, and moral wrongness means being against the will of God. 3. Because morality essentially is based on divine will, not on independently existing reasons for action, no further reasons for action are necessary. There are modified versions of the DCT that drop or qualify one or more of these three theses, but the strongest form includes all three assertions. We can characterize that position thusly: necessarily, for any person S and for all acts A, if A is forbidden, required, of S, then God commands that not A, for us. Likewise, if A is permitted for S, then God has commanded neither A nor not A for us. Bringing out the implications of this, we may list four propositions. 1. Acta is wrong if and only if it is contrary to the command of God. 2. Acta is right, required, if and only if it is commanded by God. 3. Acta is morally permissible if and only if it is permitted by the command of God. 4. If there is no God, then nothing is ethically wrong, required, or permitted. We can summarize the DCT this way: morality not only originates with God, but moral rightness simply means willed by God, and moral wrongness means being against the will of God. That is, an act is right in virtue of being permitted by the will of God, and an act is wrong in virtue of being against the will of God. Because morality essentially is based on divine will, not on independently existing reasons for action, no further reasons for action are necessary. So we may ask, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. If so, nothing is forbidden or required. Without God, we have moral nihilism. If there is no God, then nothing is ethically wrong, required, or permitted. Problems with the Divine Command Theory. There are two problems with the DCT that need to be faced by those who hold it. 1. DCT would seem to make the attribution of goodness to God redundant. When we say God is good, we think we are ascribing a property to God, but if good simply means what God commands or wills, then we are not attributing any property to God. Our statement God is good merely means God does whatever He wills to do or God practices what He preaches, and the statement God commands us to do what is good merely is the logically empty statement God commands us to do what God commands us to do. 2. DCT is that it seems to make morality into something arbitrary. If God's decree is the sole arbiter of right and wrong, it would seem to be logically possible for such heinous acts as rape, killing of the innocent for the fun of it, and gratuitous cruelty to become morally good actions if God suddenly decided to command us to do these things. Rights theory. A second duty-based approach to ethics is rights theory. Most generally, a right is a justified claim against another person's behavior, such as my right to not be harmed by you. Rights and duties are related in such a way that the rights of one person imply the duties of another person. For example, if I have a right to payment of $10 by Smith, then Smith has a duty to pay me $10. This is called the correlativity of rights and duties. The most influential early account of rights theory is that of 17th century British philosopher John Locke, who argued that the laws of nature mandate that we should not harm anyone's life, health, liberty or possessions. For Locke, these are our natural rights, given to us by God. Following Locke, the United States Declaration of Independence authored by Thomas Jefferson recognizes three foundational rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson and others rights theorists maintained that we deduce other more specific rights from these, including the rights of property, movement, speech, and religious expression. There are four features traditionally associated with moral rights. First, rights are natural insofar as they are not invented or created by governments. Second, they are universal insofar as they do not change from country to country. Third, they are equal in the sense that rights are the same for all people, irrespective of gender, race, or handicap. Fourth, they are inalienable, which means that I cannot hand over my rights to another person, such as by selling myself into slavery. Kant's Categorical Imperative. The name of the German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, is identified with the moral theory known as deontology. Kant was adamantly opposed to the idea that the outcome of an action could determine its moral worth. For deontologists, it is not consequences which determine the rightness or wrongness of an act, but, rather, the intention of the person who carries out the act. The emphasis is on the correctness of the action, regardless of the possible benefits or harm it might produce. Deontologists maintain that there are some moral obligations which are absolutely binding, no matter what consequences are produced. The categorical imperative, a Kant's duty-based theory, emphasizes a single principle of duty. Kant agreed that we have moral duties to oneself and others, such as developing one's talents, and keeping our promises to others. However, Kant argued that there is a more foundational principle of duty that encompasses our particular duties. It is a single, self-evident principle of reason that he calls the categorical imperative. Idiaresis. A categorical imperative, he argued, is fundamentally different from hypothetical imperatives that hinge on some personal desire that we have. For example, if you want to get a good job, then you ought to go to college. By contrast, a categorical imperative simply mandates an action, irrespective of one's personal desires, such as you ought to do X. To understand Kant's thought, note the emphasis he places on the idea of good intention. Kant believed that nothing was good in itself except a good will. Intelligence, judgment, and all other facets of the human personality are perhaps good and desirable, but only if the will that makes use of them is good. By will, Kant means the uniquely human capacity to act according to the concepts behind laws, that is, principles presumably operating in nature. A good will, therefore, acts in accordance with nature's laws. For Kant, a will could be good without qualification only if it always had in view one principle, whether the maxim of its action could become a universal law. This standard is such a crucial part of Kant's theory of ethics. Kant believed, then, that there was just one command or imperative that was categorical, that is, one that presented an action as necessary of itself, without regard to any other end. He believed that from this one categorical imperative, this universal command, all commands of duty could be derived. Kant's categorical imperative states that we should act in such a way that the maxim or general rule governing our action could be a universal law. Consider his example of making a promise that you are willing to break if it suits your purposes. Your maxim can be expressed thus: this maxim could not be universally acted upon, because it involves a contradiction of wills. On the same hand, you are willing to make promises and honor them. On the other hand, you are willing to beat those promises. Notice that Kant is not a utilitarian. He is not arguing that the consequences of a universal law condoning promise breaking would be bad and the rule is bad. Instead, he is claiming that the rule is self-contradictory. The institution of promise making would dissolve if such a maxim were universalized. His appeal is to logical consistency, not to consequences. Kant gives at least three versions or formulations of the categorical imperative. His categorical imperative is a deontological ethical theory, which means it is based on the idea that there are certain objective ethical rules in the world. Kant's version is possibly the most well-known, and relies heavily on his idea that all people are fundamentally capable of reasoning in the same manner and on the same level. Kantianism focuses more on intent and action in itself, as opposed to the consequentialist focus of utilitarianism. Hypothetical imperatives tell us which means best achieve our ends. They do not, however, tell us which ends we should choose. The typical dichotomy in choosing ends is between ends that are right, for example, helping someone, and those that are good, For example, enriching oneself. Kant considered the right superior to the good. To him, the good was morally irrelevant. In Kant's view, a person cannot decide whether conduct is right, or moral, through empirical means. Such judgments must be reached a priori, using pure practical reason. Reason, separate from all empirical experience, can determine the principle according to which all ends can be determined as moral. It is this fundamental principle of moral reason that is known as the categorical imperative. Pure practical reason in the process of determining it dictates what ought to be done without reference to empirical contingent factors. Moral questions are determined independent of reference to the particular subject posing them. It is because morality is determined by pure practical reason rather than particular empirical or sensuous factors that morality is universally valid. This moral universalism has come to be seen as the distinctive aspect of Kant's moral philosophy and has had wide social impact in the legal and political concepts of human rights and equality. Kant's theory is hinged by his beliefs on autonomy and his formulation of categorical imperatives. He believed that, unless a person freely and willingly makes a choice, their action has no meaning, and certainly no moral value. Autonomy allows us to be self-creating when it comes to our values and morality. Autonomy is one's own beliefs, independence, and government, acting without regard for anyone else. Conversely, heteronomy is acting under the influence of someone else and allows for an individual to consistently place blame outside of self. Kant believed that each individual is rational and capable of making free choices, thereby relies on autonomous thinking. Kant thought that every man, if using reason when looking at moral dilemmas, would agree with what he called the categorical imperative. So, while the law is objective, Kant thought that all people could come to understand and agree with it after autonomous reflection. So how, exactly, does the SID tell us how to act? How does it work? The decision-making procedure of the theory is actually quite straightforward, and one that many people should be able to grasp intuitively, which is exactly what Kant wanted to achieve. Kant thought that when a moral action is being considered, one should ask the following questions: what would happen if everyone in the world did this, all the time? And would that be the kind of world I'd like to live in? We can look at the textbook example to illustrate this: murder. So we want to know whether murder is an ethically justifiable action. Well, what would happen if everyone in the entire world started killing people? Absolute chaos would ensue. It's not the sort of world many people would like to live in. Therefore, according to the categorical imperative, murder is wrong. A core aspect of this theory is the concept of intent. To Kant, it was the intent that mattered to him. Let's look at an example. Imagine you're a murderer walking down the street, and you see a defenseless young man in front of you. It's dark, and there's no one else around. You have a knife in your pocket. It would be easy for you to kill him. So, you consider, maybe, in the end, you choose to let the man live, not because you were worried about acting immorally, but because you didn't want to take the risk of him screaming and drawing the attention of the police, or something to that effect. In the end, you do not kill. According to Kant, you haven't acted ethically. Your action does not make you a better person. This is because when you acted, or, rather, chose not to act, you weren't considering the action in terms of its morality. You didn't make a moral choice, and you merely acted out of self-preservation. However, if you were to choose not to kill the man because you suddenly realized that it was wrong to kill and didn't want to act unethically, then you would have acted morally, and would be a better person for it. Kant concludes that a moral proposition that is true must be one that is not tied to any particular conditions, including the identity of the person making the moral deliberation. A moral maxim must imply absolute necessity, which is to say that it must be disconnected from the particular physical details surrounding the proposition, and could be applied to any rational being. This leads to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, A. The principle of universality. The first maxim states that we should choose our codes of conduct only if they serve perfect, imperfect duty and are good for all. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Kant divides the duties imposed by this formulation into two subsets: perfect and imperfect duty. Perfect duties are blameworthy if not met and are the basic requirements for a human being. According to his reasoning, we first have a perfect duty not to act by maxims that result in logical contradictions when we attempt to universalize them. The moral proposition A, it is permissible to steal, would result in a contradiction upon universalization. The notion of stealing presupposes the existence of property, but were A universalized, then there could be no property, and so the proposition has logically negated itself. An example of perfect duty is the avoidance of suicide. Suicide is the end of life, and Kant believed that self-love impels the improvement of life. If a person commits suicide, improvement of life ceases. Imperfect duties are those that do not achieve blame, rather they receive praise if completed. They are circumstantial duties such as cultivating talent. They are still based on pure reason, but which allow for desires in how they are carried out in practice. Because these depend somewhat on the subjective preferences of humankind, this duty is not as strong as a perfect duty, but it is still morally binding. As such, unlike perfect duties, you do not attract blame should you not complete an imperfect duty, but you shall receive praise for it should you complete it, as you have gone beyond the basic duties and taken duty upon yourself. Imperfect duties are circumstantial, meaning simply that you could not reasonably exist in a constant state of performing that duty. This is what truly differentiates between perfect and imperfect duties, because imperfect duties are those duties that are never truly completed. Examples of imperfect duties are perfecting the ability to write and produce works. B. The principle of humanity as an end, never as merely a means. The second maxim states that we should not use humanity of ourselves or others as a means to an end. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Every rational action must set before itself not only a principle, but also an end. Most ends are of a subjective kind, because they need only be pursued if they are in line with some particular hypothetical imperative that a person may choose to adopt. For an end to be objective, it would be necessary that we categorically pursue it. This principle has received more widespread approval than any other part of Kant's moral philosophy. People, as rational beings, are ends in themselves and should never be used merely as means to other ends. We may use physical things as means, but when we use people simply as means, as in slavery, prostitution, or commercial exploitation, we degrade them and violate their innermost beings as people. The categorical imperative also regulates the morality of actions that affect us individually. For example, suicide would be wrong since I would be treating my life as a means to the alleviation of my misery. The free will is the source of all rational action, but to treat it as a subjective end is to deny the possibility of freedom in general. Because the autonomous will is the one and only source of moral action, it would contradict the first formulation to claim that a person is merely a means to some other end, rather than always an end in themselves. On this basis, Kant derives second formulation of the categorical imperative from the first. By combining this formulation with the first, we learn that a person has perfect duty not to use the humanity of themselves or others merely as a means to some other end. An example of the second maxim would be that of slavery. Although it can be realized that a slave owner has the right to own property, they do not have the right to own a person. The right to not own a person stems from the ideals of autonomy and free will. A person who is owned does not have free will and therefore is not autonomous and cannot be held to duty. The concept of slavery contradicts the first maxim, and Kant's theory does not allow for contradictions of the maxims. We should always treat people with dignity, and never use them as mere instruments. For Kant, we treat people as an end whenever our actions toward someone reflect the inherent value of that person. Donating to charity, for example, is morally correct since this acknowledges the inherent value of the recipient. By contrast, we treat someone as a means to an end whenever we treat that person as a tool to achieve something else. It is wrong, for example, to steal my neighbor's car since I would be treating her as a means to my own happiness. C. The principle of autonomy. The third maxim states that we should consider ourselves to be members in the universal realm of ends. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were through his maxim always a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. Because a truly autonomous will would not be subjugated to any interest, it would only be subject to those laws it makes for itself, but it must also regard those laws as if they would be bound to others, or they would not be universalizable, and hence they would not be laws of conduct at all. Thus Kant presents the notion of the hypothetical kingdom of ends, of which he suggests all people should consider themselves both means and ends. We should consider our actions to be of consequence to everyone else, and that our actions affect not only ourselves but that of others. Everything we do should not only be of benefit to ourselves, but benefit each other universally. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. We ought to act only by maxims that would harmonize with a possible kingdom of ends. We have perfect duty not to act by maxims that create incoherent or impossible states of natural affairs when we attempt to universalize them. And we have imperfect duty not to act by maxims that lead to unstable or greatly undesirable states of affairs. The main problem with the categorical imperative is its rigidity. The famous example that illustrates this is that of a crazed axe murderer coming to your front door and asking you where your children are. You could lie. Many would say you should lie, but imagine if everyone in the entire world lied all the time. That would not be a nice place to live in. So the categorical imperative says you can't lie. You have to tell the axe murderer the truth, so he can go and kill your children. Kant was asked about this personally, and he said that this was indeed the case. It would be immoral to lie to the man. He did, however, say that you could also choose to lock your door and call the police. Here's another example. You're in a room with a man who's holding a gun to your mother's head. You know he'll shoot her any second. Right next to you, there's a button. If you press the button, the man will fall through a trapdoor and land in a spike pit, dying instantly. Your mother will be saved. According to the categorical imperative, this would be the wrong thing to do. You can't press the button, but if you don't, your mother will die. It's in situations like this that strict ethical systems with specific decision procedures tend to fall apart. Morality is simply too complex, too full of exceptions for these theories to ever fully work. Review Kant's rule of universality. Try to see if you can give examples where you think this rule should not or could not be observed. Do you agree with Kant that the consequences of our actions are not fully in our control and so should not count in the moral appraisal of our actions? Ross's prima facie duties are moral guidelines. A fourth and more recent duty-based theory is that by British philosopher W.D. Ross, which emphasizes prima facie duties. Sir William David Ross, April 15, 1877 to May 5, 1971, usually cited as W.D. Ross, was a Scottish philosopher, known for a work in ethics. The term prima facie means at a first sight or on the surface. By prima facie duties, Ross means duties that dictate what we should do when other moral factors are not considered. Stated another way, prima facie duties are duties that generally obligate us, that is, they ordinarily impose a moral obligation but may not in a particular case because of circumstances. An actual duty is the action that one ought to perform after considering and weighing all the prima facie duties involved. According to W.D. Ross, 1877 to 1971, there are several prima facie duties that we can use to determine what, concretely, we ought to do. A prima facie duty is a duty that is binding, obligatory, other things equal, that is, unless it is overridden or trumped by another duty or duties. Another way of putting it is that where there is a prima facie duty to do something, there is at least a fairly strong presumption in favor of doing it. An example of a prima facie duty is the duty to keep promises. Unless stronger moral considerations override, one ought to keep a promise made. By contrast with prima facie duties, our actual or concrete duty is the duty we should perform in the particular situation of choice. Whatever one's actual duty is, one is morally bound to perform it. Prima facie duties relate to actual duties as reasons due to conclusions of reasoning. The term duty and prima facie duty is slightly misleading. The prima facie duties are understood as guidelines, not rules without exception. If an action does not correspond to a specific guideline, one is not necessarily violating a rule that one ought to follow. However, not following the rule one ought to follow in a particular case is failing to do one's actual duty. In such cases it makes sense to talk about violating a rule. The rule might be the same in words as a prima facie duty, minus the phrase unless other moral considerations override, but it would no longer be merely a guideline because it describes what one concretely should do. Like his 17th and 18th century counterparts, Ross argues that our duties are part of the fundamental nature of the universe. However, Ross's list of the following categories of prima facie duties is much shorter, which he believes reflects our actual moral convictions. Duties of fidelity, the duty to keep promises and the obligation not to lie. Duties of fidelity are duties to keep one's promises and contracts and not to engage in deception. Duties of reparation, this is a duty to make up for the injuries one has done to others. Ross describes this duty as resting on a previous wrongful act. It is the duty to compensate others when we harm them. If, for example, I damage something that belongs to someone else, I have an obligation to make restitution. Duties of gratitude, the duty to thank those who help us. Suppose, for example, an especially good friend is suddenly in need of assistance. I am duty-bound to do all I can help this individual, who in the past had acted so selflessly toward me. Duties of justice. The duty of justice requires that one act in such a way that one distributes benefits and burdens fairly. Ross himself emphasizes the negative aspect of this duty. He says that this type of duty rests on the fact or possibility of a distribution of pleasure or happiness, or the means thereto, that is not in accord with the merit of the persons concerned. In such cases there arises a duty to upset or prevent such a distribution. Thus, the duty of justice includes the duty, insofar as possible, to prevent an unjust distribution of benefits or burdens. Duties of beneficence. The duty to improve the conditions of others. The duty to do good to others, to foster their health, security, wisdom, moral goodness, or happiness. This duty, says Ross, rests upon the fact that there are other beings in the world whose condition we can make better in respect of virtue, or of intelligence, or of pleasure. Duties of self-improvement. The duty of self-improvement is to act so as to promote one's own good, that is, one's own health, security, wisdom, moral goodness, virtue, intelligence and happiness. Duties of non-maleficence. The duty of non-injury, also known as non-maleficence, is the duty not to harm others physically or psychologically, to avoid harming their health, security, intelligence, character, or happiness. We are obliged to avoid hurting others physically, emotionally and psychologically. Jacques Thiroux, 2001, claims that Ross' duty of non-injury includes a duty to prevent injury to others. This seems to be wrong regarding Ross, but it might be reasonable to add such a prima facie duty to the list. Non-injury in Ross' strict sense is distinct from the prevention of harm to others. Non-injury instructs us generally to avoid intentionally, negligently, or ignorantly, when ignorance is avoidable, harming others. Harm prevention instructs us generally to make a real effort to prevent harm to others from causes other than ourselves. In summary, Ross presents 7 categories of prima facie duties, although there may be more categories. However, he does insist that we acknowledge and willingly accept the 7 categories without argument. His appeal for their acceptance does not rely primarily on reason and argument but on intuition. When faced with a situation that presents conflicting prima facie duties, Ross tells us, the more obligatory, our actual duty. The actual duty has the greatest amount of prima facie rightness over wrongness. Join with classmates and imagine that you are the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. What principles would you use to govern Ethiopian society and the country? A. Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, challenging the adequacy of rule-based theories. Virtue ethics is a technical term in contemporary Western analytical moral philosophy, used to distinguish a normative ethical theory focused on the virtues, or moral character, from others such as deontology, or contractarianism, and consequentialism. Imagine a case in which it is agreed by every sort of theorist that I should, say, help someone in need. A deontologist will emphasize the fact that in offering help, I will be acting in accordance with a moral rule or principle such as do unto others as you would be done by. A consequentialist will point out that the consequences of helping will maximize well-being, and a virtue ethicist will emphasize the fact that providing help would be charitable or benevolent. A. Charity and benevolence being virtues. Aristotle's Ethics. The ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle, 384–322 BC, first wrote a detailed discussion of virtue morality in the Nicomachean Ethics. A virtus he understood as strength. Correspondingly, specific virtues are seen as strengths of character. But, many years after Aristotle's death, virtue theory came to be overshadowed by the development of utilitarianism and deontology. In the past 50 years, however, virtue theory has resurfaced as a major moral theory. But why is that so? Virtue ethics has been restated and reinvigorated in the years since 1958 by philosophers such as Philippa Foot, Alistair MacIntyre and Elizabeth Anscombe. They and many others became disillusioned with the promises of mainstream theories. They argue that how we ought to live could be much more adequately answered by a virtue-based theory than in terms of calculating consequences or obeying rules. Key questions which virtue ethical systems ask include: what sort of person do I want to be? What virtues are characteristic of the person I want to be? What actions will cultivate the virtues I want to possess? What actions will be characteristic of the sort of person I want to be? With respect to the good, right, happiness, The good is not a disposition. The good involves a teleological system that involves actions. A good is that which all things aim. Something is good if it performs its proper function. For example, a good coffee cup or a good red oak. A right action is that which is conducive to the good, and different goods correspond to the differing sciences and arts. The God or best good is that which is desired for its own sake and for the sake which we desire all other ends or goods. For human beings, eudaimonia is activity of the soul in accordance with arete, excellence, virtue, or what it's good for. Eudaimonia is living well and doing well in the affairs of the world. B. The good of human beings cannot be answered with the exactitude of a mathematical problem, since mathematics starts with general principles and argues to conclusions. Ethics starts with actual moral judgments before the formulation of general principles. Aristotle presupposes natural tendencies in people. C. Aristotle distinguishes between happiness, eudaimonia, and moral virtue. Moral virtue is not the end of life, for it can go with inactivity, misery, and unhappiness. Happiness, the end of life, that to which all aims, is activity in accordance with reason. Reason is the arete or peculiar excellence of persons. A. Happiness is an activity involving both moral and intellectual arete. B. Some external goods are necessary in order to exercise that activity. The good character. A. People have a natural capacity for good character, and it is developed through practice. The capacity does not come first, it's developed through practice. The sequence of human behavior raises the question of which is preeminent, acts or dispositions. Their interaction is broken by Aristotle's distinction between acts which create good dispositions and acts which flow from the good disposition once it has been created. Arete is a disposition developed out of a capacity by the proper exercise of that capacity. Habits are developed through acting. A person's character is the structure of habits and is formed by what we do. B. Virtue, arete, or excellence is defined as a mean between two extremes of excess and defect on regard to a feeling or action as the practically wise person would determine it. The mean cannot be calculated a priori. The mean is relative to the individual and circumstances. For example, consider the following traits: Aristotelian virtues and vices, sphere of action, fear, pleasure and pain, acquisition, minor, acquisition, major, anger, self-expression, conversation, social conduct, exhibition, and indignation. A vice of deficiency: cowardice, insensibility, tightwad, undue humility, unirascibility, self-deprecating, boorishness, cantankerous, shamelessness and spitefulness. A mean or virtue: courage, temperance, liberality, pride or proper ambition, patience or good temper, truthfulness, wittiness, friendliness, modesty and righteous indignation. Vice of excess: foolhardiness, self-indulgence, spendthrift or prodigality, undue vanity, hot-headedness, boastfulness, buffoonery, obsequiousness, shyness and envy. AF. The level of courage necessary is different for a philosophy teacher, a commando, and a systems programmer. Phronesis or practical wisdom is the ability to see the right thing to do in the circumstances. Notice, especially, Aristotle's theory does not imply ethical relativism because there are appropriate standards. In the ontological dimension, virtue is a mean. In the axiological dimension, it is an extreme or excellence. Martin Luther King, Jr. relates his struggle to understand this difference in his letter from Birmingham jail when he wrote, "You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extremely a broken bar, but though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love a broken bar? Was not Amos an extremist for justice a broken bar? Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel a broken bar?" Perhaps the South, the nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Some presumptively virtuous behaviors can be an extreme as when, for example, the medieval philosopher Peter Abbe tilde copyright Lard explains, "No long time thereafter I was smitten with a grievous illness, brought upon me by my immoderate zeal for study." Peter Abbe tilde copyright Lard, Historia Calamitatum trans. Ralph Adams Cram, St. Paul, M.N., Thomas A. Boyd, 1922, 4. In the ontological dimension, virtue is a mean. In the axiological dimension, it is an extreme or excellence. For example, Hartman's diagram. Pleasure and pain are powerful determinants of our actions. 3. Pleasure is the natural accompaniment of unimpeded activity. Pleasure, as such, is neither good nor bad. Even so, Pleasure is something positive and its effect is to perfect the exercise of activity. Everything from playing chess to making love is improved with skill. B. Pleasure cannot be directly sought, it is a side product of activity. It is only an element of happiness. C. The good person, the one who has attained eudaimonia, is the standard as to what is truly pleasant or unpleasant. 4. Friendship. A person's relationship to a friend is the same as the relation to oneself. The friend can be thought of as a second self. A. In friendship a person loves himself, egoism, not as one seeks money for himself, but as he gives his money away to receive honor. B. The kinds of friendship. If idearesis utility, if idearesis pleasure, if idearesis the good endures as long as both retain their character. V. The contemplative faculty, the exercise of perfect happiness in intellectual or philosophic activity. A. Reason is the highest faculty of human beings. We can engage in it longer than other activities. B. Philosophy is loved as an end in itself, and so eudaimonia implies leisure and self-sufficiency as an environment for contemplation. Aristotle on pleasure. A summary of Aristotle's ethics clarifies several important distinctions between happiness and pleasure. 1. Eudaimonia, the state of personal well-being, having self-worth, exhibiting a zest for life, radiating energy, achieving happiness, good spirit, or self-presence. 2. Hence, happiness is activity of the soul in accordance with their copyright, excellence or virtue. A. That is, living well and doing well in the affairs of the world. B. Picture yourself at your best. Compare Maslow's self-actualizing person or Jung's individuation of a person with Aristotle's description of eudaimonia. 3. Good is that to which all things aim, that is, the good is that which performs its proper function. A. What constitutes a good wrench or a good coffee cup? The peculiar copyright of excellence is established by its purpose. The peculiar excellence is teleological. B. What constitutes a good person? 1. Activity of the soul in accordance with reason, that capacity which is unique to us as persons. 2. This activity is both moral, doing the right thing at the right time, and intellectual copyright, practical wisdom or phronesis. 3. Aristotle notes that some external goods are necessary for the exercise of that activity. 4. Moral virtue is not the end of life, for it can go with inactivity, misery, and unhappiness. What is good for a person cannot be answered with the exactitude of mathematics. A. Ethics attempts to formulate general principles whose application is dependent upon the circumstances at hand, that is, initial conditions. Note that Aristotle's theory does not imply ethical relativism. B. The doctrine of the mean is not a doctrine of relativism but doctrine applied to specific circumstances. For example, what and how much one needs differs for a weightlifter and a ballerina. Even so, proper diet has guidelines and standards which apply differently according to different initial conditions. By pleasure, itself, is a side product of activity. Pleasure results from activity without hindrance. 1. As Aristotle expresses it, pleasure is the natural accompaniment of unimpeded activity. 2. Pleasure, as such, is neither good nor bad, but is something positive because the effect of pleasure perfects the exercise of that activity. 3. Even so, Aristotle emphasizes that pleasure is not to be sought for its own sake. Cf. The hedonistic paradox. Try these summary questions. A. How do you understand the idea of a virtue? Consider someone whom you think is a virtuous. How would you describe them? What kinds of behavior or attitudes of the person would you offer as moral indicators of virtue? B. Does a good doctor or nurse have certain characteristic A virtues? If you had to write a short essay on the caring professional, a life of virtue, what would you have to say? If you believe that virtue is not relevant as a focus in healthcare, try and explain why. Non-normative ethics/meta-ethics. What is meta-ethics? Suppose I am debating with a friend the question whether or not we ought to give to famine relief, whether or not we are morally obliged to give to famine relief. The sorts of questions philosophers raise about this kind of debate fall roughly into two groups. First, there are first-order questions about which party in the debate, if any, is right, and why. Then, there are second-order questions about what the parties in the debate are doing when they engage in it. Roughly, the first-order questions are the province of normative ethics, and the second-order questions are the province of metaethics. As one recent writer puts it, in metaethics, we are concerned not with questions which are the province of normative ethics like should I give to famine relief? Or should I return the wallet I found in the street? But with questions about questions like these. Metaethics tries to answer question, such as, what does good, right, or justice mean? What makes something good or right? Is moral realism true? Is morality irreducible, cognitive, or overriding? Do intrinsic values exist? It is important to be clear that in normative ethics we do not just look for an answer to the question should we give to famine relief? We also look for some insight into why the right answer is right. It is in their answers to this latter sort of why question that the classic theories in normative ethics disagree. Examples of such theories include Utilitarianism. One ought to give to famine relief because that particular action, of those possible, contributes most to the greater happiness of the greatest number. Rule utilitarianism. One ought to give to famine relief because giving to famine relief is prescribed by a rule the general observance of which contributes most to the greater happiness of the greatest number. And Kantianism. One ought to give to famine relief because universal refusal to give to famine relief would generate some kind of inconsistency. Normative ethics thus seeks to discover the general principles underlying moral practice, and in this way potentially impacts upon practical moral problems. Different general principles may yield different verdicts in particular cases. Metaethics, rather, concerned with questions about the following: a. Meaning. What is the semantic function of moral discourse? Is the function of moral discourse to state facts, or does it have some other non-fact stating role? B. Metaphysics. Do moral facts, or properties, exist? If so, what are they like? Are they identical or reducible to some other type of fact, or property, or are they irreducible and sui generis? C. Epistemology and justification. Is there such a thing as moral knowledge? How can we know whether our moral judgments are true or false? How can we ever justify our claims to moral knowledge? D. Phenomenology. How are moral qualities represented in the experience of an agent making a moral judgment? Do they appear to be out there in the world? E. Moral psychology. What can we say about the motivational state of someone making a moral judgment? What sort of connection is there between making a moral judgment and being motivated to act as that judgment prescribes? F. Objectivity. Can moral judgments really be correct or incorrect? Can we work towards finding out the moral truth? Obviously, this list is not intended to be exhaustive, and the various questions are not all independent. For example, a positive answer to F looks, on the face of it, to presuppose that the function of moral discourse is to state facts. But it is worth noting that the list is much wider than many philosophers 40 or 50 years ago would have thought. For example, one such philosopher writes, "Metaphysics is not about what people ought to do. It is about what they are doing when they talk about what they ought to do." The idea that metaphysics is exclusively about language was no doubt due to the more general idea that philosophy as a whole has no function other than the study of ordinary language and that philosophical problems only arise from the application of words out of the context in which they are ordinarily used. Fortunately, this ordinary language conception of philosophy has long since ceased to hold sway, and the list of metaphysical concerns in metaphysics, epistemology, phenomenology and moral psychology, as well as in semantics and the theory of meaning bears this out. Positions in metaphysics can be defined in terms of the answers they give to these sorts of questions. Some examples of metaphysical theories are moral realism, non-cognitivism, error theory and moral Internalism. Cognitivism and non-cognitivism consider a particular moral judgment, such as the judgment that murder is wrong. What sort of psychological state does this express? Some philosophers, called cognitivists, think that a moral judgment such as this expresses a belief. Beliefs can be true or false, they are truth apt, or apt to be assessed in terms of truth and falsity. So cognitivists think that moral judgments are capable of being true or false. On the other hand, non-cognitivists think that moral judgments express non-cognitive states such as emotions or desires. Desires and emotions are not truth apt, so moral judgments are not capable of being true or false. Note that, although it may be true that I have a desire for a pint of beer and false that I have a desire to see Ethiopia win the World Cup, this does not imply that desires themselves can be true or false. Strong cognitivism, naturalism. A strong cognitivist theory is one which holds that moral judgments, a, are apt for evaluation in terms of truth and falsity, and, b, can be the upshot of cognitively accessing the facts which render them true. Strong cognitivist theories can be either naturalist or non-naturalist. According to a naturalist, a moral judgment is rendered true or false by a natural state of affairs, and it is this natural state of affairs to which a true moral judgment affords us access. But what is a natural state of affairs? G.E. Moore's characterization: by nature, then, I do mean and have meant that which is the subject matter of the natural sciences and also of psychology. A natural property is a property which figures in one of the natural sciences or in psychology. Examples might include the property of being conducive to the greatest happiness of the greatest number and the property of being conducive to the preservation of the human species. A natural state of affairs is simply a state of affairs that consists in the instantiation of a natural property. Naturalist cognitivists hold that moral properties are identical to, or reducible to, natural properties. The Cornell realists, for example Nicholas Sturgeon, Richard Boyd, and David Brink, think that moral properties are irreducible natural properties in their own right. Naturalist reductionists, for example Richard, that moral properties are reducible to the other natural properties that are the subject matter of the natural sciences and psychology. Both the Cornell realists and the naturalist reductionists are moral realists. They think that there really are moral facts and moral properties, and that the existence of these moral facts and instantiation of these moral properties is constitutively independent of human opinion. Strong cognitivism, non-naturalism. Non-naturalists think that moral properties are not identical to or reducible to natural properties. They are irreducible and sui generis. We will look at two types of strong cognitivist non-naturalism: Moore's ethical non-naturalism, as developed in his Principia Ethica, first published in 1903. According to which the property of moral goodness is non-natural, simple, and unanalyzable, and the contemporary version of non-naturalism that has been developed by John McDowell and David Wiggins, roughly from the 1970s to the present day. Again, both types of non-naturalists are moral realists. They think that there really are moral facts and moral properties, and that the existence of these moral facts and instantiation of these moral properties is constitutively independent of human opinion. Strong cognitivism without moral realism. Mackey's error theory. John Mackey has argued that although moral judgments are apt to be true or false, and that moral judgments, if true, would afford us cognitive access to moral facts, moral judgments are in fact always false. This is because there simply are no moral facts or properties in the world of the sort required to render our moral judgments true. We have no plausible epistemological account of how we can access such facts and properties, and, moreover, such properties and facts would be metaphysically queer, unlike anything else in the universe as we know it. A moral property would have to be such that the mere apprehension of it by a moral agent would be sufficient to motivate that agent to act. Mackey finds this idea utterly problematic. He concludes that there are no moral properties or moral facts, so that, positive, atomic, moral judgments are uniformly false. Our moral thinking involves us in a radical error. Because Mackey denies that there are moral facts or properties, he is not a moral realist, but a moral anti-realist. Weak cognitivism about morals without moral realism. Best opinion theories. A weak cognitivist theory is one which holds that moral judgments, a, are apt for evaluation in terms of truth and falsity, but, b, cannot be the upshot of cognitive access to moral properties and states of affairs. Weak cognitivism thus agrees with strong cognitivism on A, but disagrees on B. An example of a weak cognitivist theory would be one which held that our best judgments about morals determine the extensions of moral predicates, rather than being based upon some faculty which tracks, detects or cognitively accesses facts about the instantiation of moral properties. The extension of a predicate is the class of things, events or objects to which that predicate may correctly be applied. Moral judgments are thus capable of being true or false, even though they are not based on a faculty with a tracking, accessing or detecting a role. In other words, even though true moral judgments are not the upshot of cognitive access to moral states of affairs. This view thus rejects moral realism, not by denying the existence of moral facts, like the error theory, but by denying that those facts are constitutively independent of human opinion. Non-cognitivism. Non-cognitivists deny that moral judgments are even apt to be true or false. Non-cognitivists thus disagree with both weak and strong cognitivism. We shall look at a number of arguments which the non-cognitivist uses against cognitivism. An example of such an argument is the argument from moral psychology. Suppose that moral judgments can express beliefs. As the cognitivist claims, being motivated to do something or to pursue a course of action is always a matter of having a belief and a desire. For example, I am motivated to reach for the fridge because I believe that it contains water and I have a desire for water. But it is an internal and necessary fact about an agent that, if she sincerely judges that X is good, she is motivated to pursue the course of action X. So if a moral judgment expressed a belief, it would have to be a belief which sustained an internal and necessary connection to a desire. It would have to be a necessary truth that an agent who possessed the belief would inter alia possess the desire. But no belief is necessarily connected to a desire because, as Hume claimed, beliefs and desires are distinct existences, and it is impossible to have a necessary connection between distinct existences. So it cannot be the case that moral judgments express beliefs. So moral judgments are not truth-apt. If moral judgments cannot express beliefs, what do they express? We shall look at three versions of non-cognitivism which give different answers to this question. Idearis J. Ayres Emotivism, 1936, according to which moral judgments express emotions, or sentiments of approval or disapproval. Simon Blackburn's Quasi-Realism, 1984, according to which moral judgments express our dispositions to form sentiments of approval or disapproval, and Alan Gibbard's Norm-Expressivism, 1990, according to which our moral judgments express our acceptance of norms. Perhaps the main challenge to non-cognitivism is what is called the Frege problem. According to emotivism, for example, judging that murder is wrong is really just like shouting boo for murder. When I shout boo, I am evincing my disapproval. I am not attempting to describe something. But what about if murder is wrong? Then it is wrong to murder your mother-in-law. This makes sense. But on the emotivist interpretation it doesn't. What would it sound like on an emotivist interpretation? Internalism and externalism, Humanism and anti-Humanism. One of the premises in the argument from moral psychology above is the claim that there is an internal and necessary connection between sincerely making a moral judgment and being motivated to act in the manner prescribed by that judgment. This claim is known as internalism, because it says that there is an internal or conceptual connection between moral judgment and motivation. Make note of some of the ethical behavior you witness in your family. How would you classify these behaviors? What impact do they have on your life? Write up your findings. Some cognitivist philosophers respond to the argument from moral psychology by denying internalism. They claim that the connection between judgment and motivation is only external and contingent. Such philosophers are known as externalists. Other cognitivist philosophers respond to the argument from moral psychology by denying another premise of the argument, the claim that motivation always involves the presence of both beliefs and desires. This premise is known as the Humean theory of motivation. Since it received a classic exposition by Hume, McDowell and Wiggins advance an anti-Humean theory of motivation, according to which beliefs themselves can be intrinsically motivating. Generally, metaethics examines the meaning of moral terms and concepts and the relationships between these concepts, explores where moral values, such as a personhood and a autonomy, come from, considers the difference between moral values and other kinds of values, examines the way in which moral claims are justified. Metaethics also poses questions of the following kind. What do we mean by the claim, a life is sacred? Are moral claims a matter of personal view, religious belief or social standard, or are they objective in some sense? If they are objective, what make them so? Is there a link between human psychology and the moral claims that humans make? We have reached the end of Chapter 2, Approaches to Ethics. So far we have learned about how ethics is one of the most important disciplines that need to be taught to the students to adopt ethical behavior with respect to good life. It promotes healthy society and fulfilling experience for individual. In the globalized era, we find that ethics will be one of the enablers of competitiveness. Stressing the centrality of ethics in the human experience can be a greater favor to humankind in general, and to our society in particular, to be growing and prosper by qualities that are essentially and absolutely ethical. Morality concerned about habits, customs, ways of life, especially when these are assessed as good or bad, right or wrong. Moral values help to regulate the behavior as a standard. Such values help to maintain the society and act uniformly. They bring about peace and stability. So individuals have a moral responsibility to respect and maintain the value of their society and refrain from committing things that disturb its stability and peace. While utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue theory have been in place in the canon of moral philosophy for centuries, they have not remained fixed and static as theories. Volumes have been written which critique elements of these theories, sharpening them for greater clarity and, attuning them more to the fullness of human living. In addition, insights into moral living come in fresh forms, breathing new life into the traditional moral canon. This is the case with contemporary ethical theories such as Principlism, Normative Ethics and Feminist Ethics. In these we find new insights that attempt a number of tasks, to offer developments of, and improvements on, essential features of traditional theories, to fill in the dimensions of human living that were often omitted or understated in traditional theorizing, and to acknowledge that the challenges of moral development require that we move from a realm of moral abstractions to concrete situations. This allows us to see whether or how much the resources of moral theory help to guide our decision-making and moral judgments. You should now be able to discuss ideas, feelings and questions about activities regarded as right or wrong, good or bad. Explain why there are particular rules about what is right or wrong, good or bad behavior for different groups and situations, and analyze the ethical dimensions of various rules and codes of behavior. You should also check that you can examine the personal and community factors involved in defining beliefs about what is right or wrong, good or bad behavior. Analyze how different contexts and situations influence personal values, attitudes, beliefs and behaviors, as well as critically analyze how groups justify particular actions and behaviors. Feel free to listen to this audiobook again if you are unsure. Visit our channel for the next section. Thank you for reading with us.